Your powers are weak, old man.
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
All right. Now, this is from the BBC News. We keep going back and forth with this slavery thing. I don't know what planet people drop in from, but the African Foundations of New York. The remains of 20,000 African men, women, and children have lain beneath the busy streets of New York for 300 years, waiting till their stories on the extent of slavery in the city. In March 1992, leading African-American archaeologist Michael Blakely arrived at the burial ground in downtown Manhattan. I had read about these people documented as chattel. Now I was going to learn about these Africans in New York as human beings. A haunting sight greeted him. Being winter, work was taking place underneath a translucent plastic tent. I had never really seen an excavation like that one. There were many excavators working and kerosene heaters going. By the time I got there, about a dozen burials were in process of being exposed. One could see very clearly the positions they were meant to put them at peace when they were buried. Many had their arms crossed. One female skeleton had tiny bones by her side, suggesting a woman cradling a newborn. They had devastating secrets to share, information that will reveal the extent of slavery in New York. Quite early on, we found the skull and thorax of an individual who, with filed or culturally modified teeth, and that stunned me because that is very rare, Mr. Blakely said. There are only about 9 skeletons in the whole of the Americas that have been discovered with filed teeth, he said. In the African burial ground, we found at least 27 individuals with filed teeth. This suggested that these people had come to New York directly from Africa before importation was banned in 1808. And American slaveholders started breeding slaves on the plantations in the South. These kinds of irreversible identifiers put people at risk who might want to escape, Mr. Blakely said. Runaway adverts in newspapers seeking to recapture the many escaped enslaved Africans often mention dental modification, he said, so no one would not choose to have that kind of marker. But these enslaved Africans helped create the city of New York. They worked as stevedores in the docks, as laborers building the fortification known as Wall Street, which protected the city against attack from Native Americans. Evidence from the burial site revealed for the first time the enormous human cost of such work. Half of the remains were of children under the age of 12. Women were usually dead by 40. It seems that it was cost effective for slave traders to work people to death and then simply replace them. So they sought to get Africans who were as young as possible but ready to work, said Mr. Blakely. The woman designated Burial 340 was a very intriguing person. She was in her 40s, and for the burial ground population, that makes her kind of old, said archaeologist Cheryl Wilson, now director of the interpretation at the African burial ground. Around her waist, the woman wore a belt of over 100 beads and cowrie shells, she said. In some parts of Africa in the 1700s, it's illegal for people who are not members of royal families to own even one of these beads. And she has over 100 buried with her, she added. Such treasures are known to belong to Akan-speaking people. Had this woman been born into royalty in Ghana and died a slave in New York City? And who chose to bury her with a waist of beads? These are very valuable items, said Mrs. Wilson. It implies that whoever buried her could have chosen to sell those items to feed themselves, but they made the choice to bury them with her. Perhaps it was a tradition, a rite, or an act of defiance against those who had enslaved a woman of noble birth. Skeletons of 18th century slaves have spoken to those living free today to remind us that New York, one of the world's great immigrant cities, destroyed as well as created destinies. Now, this is just more proof, right? And there's 20,000 remains, or so they say. And they, like I said, the archaeologists, I don't know how people can even begin to deny it. They dig up remains with proof of these people coming from someplace else, with artifacts coming from someplace else, with cowrie shells, with other artifacts that designate where these people come from. And we keep getting people that misread books and misread information and don't put information into context. And then they get on commenting with half information. Like I said, this stuff that they think that is fresh and new, we debated this stuff over 35 years ago in break rooms, in book studies, after conscious community meetings, after African church meetings, in classes, in lectures. We debated this stuff for years with some of the authors that they quote. And some of those authors that they quote, they were in blue jeans and in sandals when I met them. Or if they first printed the book, they would have them in bookstores. And we sit around as we discuss their book with the author and ask them questions. And these people read this stuff 30 years later, and then they don't even read it accurately. Every time somebody gives me something to read and I reread what they've said, guess what? It turns out they haven't even interpreted the information properly. And they keep giving you books to read about with certain authors. I said, you guys haven't even read the book. You guys quote books that people tell you what's in it. You haven't even read it. And sometimes I get mad because somebody will give me a book to read. I'll look up the book. And sometimes I just look up the introduction. And I read 5 pages and said, did this person actually read this book? And if they read it, do they know what they read? And you know what my spiritual teacher, man, told me back in, I think, 1996? He always told me, you have to bring books to the book. No book stands on its own. You have to bring books to the book. You read one book, you read the second, the third, the fourth, and fifth. They don't all agree. They don't all agree with every point. Sometimes they will defer, but the thing is, the central core, the central facts will pop up again and again and again and again. And in fact, it's like a fish bone, right? With little bones attached to the spine. Those things, that thing will line up. The central core of what they're talking about will always be the same. And there's books that go back 200 years. Those things line up. History has to line up. You can't have like millions of people doing millions of things and making up stuff. People on the ground have no reason to lie. They can't look 500 years in the future and say, well, I'm going to deceive these people so people will think that something different happened 500 years in the future. They could care less. I always talk about white people's information. The reason I even started on this journey about finding out what happened to the slaves, because I was in the fucking slave castle with African guides telling me what used to go on. They told me that most women did not make it on the boats. They said most women that were enslaved or sold normally were made concubines, and they got pregnant and they couldn't get on the boat. They had to be used someplace else. If you go to Elmina, where the castle is, there's a whole town, a whole city, a whole section reserved for the slave traders and their wives and the concubines that had children. There's a whole group of people. Can't remember. I think they're called Fanti. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but the whole group of people that were mulattoes. They made their own little tribe. They were mixed in. On their own little tribe, they were actually mixed in. This is not new. The first I ever heard of a trade, I do mean a trade, was not from a book. It's from an experience back, I would say, this 13 years ago now, 14 years ago now. An experience I had in a slave castle from a guy walking us through the path and telling us what was going on. And you could see pictures of the Africans having coffles marching these people to the slave castle. It was a trade, and a trade still goes on. It doesn't go on the same way where you put folks on a boat and shipping them out, because that's illegal. But they're sold off to the Arabs. They sold off to North Africa. They still are. They call them servants instead of slaves. They call them indentured servants, which is what they called them in Europe. They called them indentured servants. But the trade still goes on. I just saw a movie where the trade still goes on, even today. I don't know what you guys are talking about. But anyway, I just wanted to read that into the record and put that up. Just one more piece, one more brick in the wall, as they say. Anyway, I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one.